On February 24, 2022, Russia unleashed what President Vladimir Putin called a special military operation, expecting Kyiv to fall within days. But this meticulously planned invasion quickly unraveled, revealing a series of critical miscalculations that would redefine modern warfare. This is the hour-by-hour account of how the Russian plan collapsed almost immediately. Day 102 hours Kyiv local time. American CIA stations, hidden in underground shelters near the Belarus and Russia border, and operated in coordination with Ukrainian intelligence, detected a dramatic surge in Russian radio and cellular activity. United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken made a stunning public announcement. Russia would invade Ukraine. It was no longer a question of if but when. In Ukraine, territorial defense units had already been mobilized, though many criticized the delay in their activation in the week prior. 03. The United States warned the UN that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was imminent. In Kyiv, Russian special forces were discovered and attacked by Kyiv civilians, police, and military personnel. Russian special forces sustained heavy losses, largely forcing them to abort their objectives. Explosions were reported along the border with Belarus and in eastern Ukraine. U.S. satellite and human intelligence confirmed preparations for a massive air assault originating from Belarusian and Russian airfields. Indications were that the Russians would attempt to seize key airports outside Kyiv with helicopter assault forces, then rapidly fly in reinforcements using traditional airlift. In the northwestern Black Sea, Russia declared a complete prohibition on maritime traffic. The Russian Federal Agency for Sea and Inland Water Transport then declared a suspension of all maritime traffic in the Sea of Azov due to the anti-terrorist operations underway by the Black Sea Fleet. Vladimir Putin then appeared on national television, announcing the start of a military operation in Ukraine. As Putin addressed the Russian people, conventional Russian forces began to move across the Belarusian-Ukrainian and Russian-Ukrainian borders. Ukrainian forces did not contest most of these incursions, opting instead to utilize the terrain and lay ambushes for the slowly invading columns. This strategy proved effective as somewhere in northern Ukraine, a territorial defense soldier lined up his sights on an interloping Russian helicopter. The American-made Stinger's missile utilized a battery coolant unit and pressurized argon gas to cool its seeker to extreme temperatures, making the infrared signature of the helicopter stand out in the cool sky like a blazing sun. The missile then used infrared and ultraviolet sensors to lock on to its target. The Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter automatically fired flares once it detected it had been locked on. But the missile's seeker wasn't fooled and smashed into the upper rotor assembly, sending the attack helicopter spiraling to the ground. Meanwhile, Russian electronic warfare assets launched a comprehensive campaign against Ukrainian assets. Air defense radars were significantly degraded, as were radio communications. Kaliber cruise missiles impacted air defense sites that had been abandoned just 24 hours prior, with Ukrainian defenders moving frequently to avoid targeting in the days leading up to the war. The Russian electronic warfare campaign was initially extremely effective, crippling Ukraine's ability to coordinate its response effectively. Missile and air strikes against cellular network towers began and would continue through the next 48 hours. But this early success would rapidly become a self-inflicted wound for the Russians. Russian intelligence assets, having penetrated the Ukrainian countryside days and even weeks before the invasion, found they were unable to communicate with higher headquarters. They had relied on Ukrainian cellular networks for communications, and those were now being systematically destroyed by the Russian military. This critical lack of coordination and planning between various facets of the Russian military and intelligence would lead to a failure to exploit crucial advantages in the coming days, actively sabotaging pre-war Russian tactical goals. It was at this time that Russian missiles began impacting Kyiv, Kharkiv, and defense sites across Odessa. 05. Russian air and missile attacks struck airfields around Kharkiv and military targets in Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. 5:30. Martial law took effect nationwide under President Zelenskyy's decree. 06. Russian Kaliber missiles targeted Hostomel Airport and the nearby National Guard base, but the strikes were largely ineffective. 066. Explosions ripped through Borispil Airport, targeting military infrastructure, aircraft shelters, and civilian cargo aircraft. With inbound Russian air assault units confirmed, Ukrainian defenders were being rerouted to defend the airports, but the response was slow due to general confusion and Russian electronic interference with communications networks. 6:34. Ukraine foreign minister publicly confirmed that Russian forces had invaded Ukraine from the north and east. On the Black Sea, a small squadron of Russian ships was steaming towards the strategically vital Zminy Island, otherwise known as Snake Island. 07. The Russian missile cruiser Moskva and patrol ship Vasily Baikov led the amphibious force targeting Snake Island. The island was strategically important for control over the northwestern portions of the Black Sea and the approach to Odessa, a critical trade port for Ukraine that allowed it to access global markets. On the island, a detachment of 13 Ukrainian border guards was ordered to surrender by the Russian task force. Famously, the radio reply was picked up and echoed across the country and the world beyond. Russian warship, go f yourself. Russian ships began a bombardment of the island as a small amphibious force of Russian Marines launched an assault. A number of Ukrainian soldiers, including the ones who sent the famous radio message of resistance, survived the assault and were taken prisoner. They would later be released as part of prisoner swaps, and their message of defiance was echoed around the world in pro-Ukrainian demonstrations. Also, as around Sevelsiv, a massive Russian attack began advancing toward Kyiv out of Belgorod. The bulk of the attack was aimed at Kharkiv, with a secondary attack aimed at Vovchansk, with plans to continue to Chuhuiv. Russian airstrikes targeted Ukrainian airfields, hindering the Ukrainian Air Force's ability to mount a defense against Russian incursions. More air and missile strikes targeted Ukrainian command centers in a bid to paralyze the Ukrainian military. Russia was mirroring U.S. strategy during both invasions of Iraq. However, due to a lack of coordination capabilities and training, the Russian strategy was partially ineffective. The Ukrainian Air Force would survive the day and rally to push back Russian attack aircraft from the heart of Ukraine. Russian aerospace forces encountered unexpectedly fierce resistance. The missile campaign against Ukrainian ground defenses was largely ineffective, as Ukrainian forces had wisely repositioned from their previous day's locations. A lack of post-strike damage assessment capabilities meant it could take days, or a week or more, for Russia to confirm if a strike had been successful, by which times the target was either heavily defended or no longer in its last location. This was in stark contrast to the average 15 to 30-minute capability of U.S. Air Forces. Some within the Russian FIASCO were expressing doubts about their capability to mirror a U.S.-style air campaign. Public reporting varied, but as many as 4 attack aircraft may have been downed by Ukrainian defenders in the opening hours of the war. Furthermore, Russia's electronic warfare was actually too effective. In their rush to jam Ukrainian signals, they failed to coordinate their own frequencies. Without this coordination, Russian jamming units accidentally blinded their own radios and radars, effectively sabotaging the very advantage they sought to gain. The Russian Air Assault Task Force targeting Hostomel Airport took off from VD, Bolshoi Bokov Airport in Belarus. The attack included paratroopers from the 31st Guards Air Assault Brigade, the 45th Guards Spetsnaz Brigade, and allegedly elements of the 11th Guards Air Assault Brigade. Mi-8 helicopters carried between 200 and 300 troops, while security was provided by K-52 and Mi-24 attack helicopters. 10:30. The Hostomel Air Assault Force came under intense fire from small arms and American Stinger missiles. Many were hit, some damaged enough to be forced to turn back or land. An unknown number were downed. 10:45. 5 MiG-29s of the Ukrainian 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade intercepted the Hostomel Air Assault Force. Russian fighters were flying top cover for the helicopters, but had difficulty spotting the Ukrainians until they were near, due to them flying low and thus kicking up ground scatter on radar. The Ukrainians managed to destroy 2 of the helicopters and harass the ground. Attack fighters meant to support the assault, forcing them to disengage. No Ukrainians were downed as they made their escape. 11. The main air assault force successfully reached Hostomel Airport just northwest of Kyiv. The city's air defenses, significantly degraded by the electronic warfare campaign and missile strikes, had been forced to relocate. However, a number of the ground attack fighter bombers the assault force was counting on had been forced to retreat due to Ukrainian fighter attacks. The helicopter assault approached unnoticed due to thick and low cloud cover, and the only warning the defending soldiers had was the sound of the rotor blades. Preceding the landings, Ka-52 and Mi-24 helicopters unleashed rocket attacks on Ukrainian defensive positions. Months later, it would be revealed that a Ukrainian airport employee had informed Russian intelligence of the exact positions of Ukrainian defenders. Despite this, the rocket attack failed to inflict significant damage on the defenders. 11. In Kharkiv, the Russians launched a lightning assault into the city. Russian light armor and reconnaissance forces penetrated into the Kharkiv outskirts, but were ambushed by Ukrainian regulars and territorial defense forces. The defenders launched attacks with the goal of fragmenting enemy columns, preventing Russian forces from consolidating and massing firepower. The counterattacks were extremely successful, and Russia's plan to take Kharkiv on day one failed. This would have profound strategic consequences for the Eastern Theater, dramatically increasing the number of casualties Russia would ultimately suffer in its attempt to pacify the East. 11:10. The helicopter assault force targeting Hostomel began to land. Initially, they faced sporadic fire from the Ukrainian defenders, a group largely made up of conscripts who were under-equipped and had no previous combat experience. By comparison, Russia's assault was being carried out by some of the few military units within the Russian military, who received regular and comprehensive training. The initial landing was lightly contested, but Zeus met increasingly stiff resistance, not helped by the fact that they had landed in the fields and runways of the airport complex, leaving them extremely exposed to defensive fire. To make matters worse, the ground attack element the paratroopers were counting on was only moderately effective in suppressing the airport's defenses. The defenders rallied, and resistance stiffened significantly, leading to large casualties among the attacking paratroopers. 12. Additional Russian paratroopers had successfully landed, allowing them to disperse across a wider area of the airport. Ukrainian defenders began to run out of ammunition and were forced into retreat. With the capture of a final group of defenders in the northern sector of the airport, the assault was successful. A flight of 18 Ilyushin Il-76 airlifters received clearance to continue its route to the now captured airport. These large cargo aircraft were carrying hundreds of troops and heavy vehicles, including tanks. The Russian plan was to create an air bridge into the heart of Ukraine and rally out of the airport to capture Kyiv after linking up with the attacking force south from Belarus. It was strategically ambitious, and if successful, would end the war within 72 hours. 12:30. In the east, Russian forces and their Donbas proxies pushed west out of Donetsk and Luhansk. Their objective was to break through Ukrainian trenches and secure a pathway to the heart of the country. However, here they faced Ukraine's most seasoned defenders, who had been in constant conflict since the 2014 invasion. Ukraine's defensive trench lines repelled numerous assaults, proving significantly more difficult to break than Russian military planners had overconfidently estimated. Up until now, Ukraine's forces had faced largely irregular Donbas separatists and small Russian special forces groups. It was expected the full might of the Russian war machine could grind these defenses under the treads of thousands of armored vehicles. But forward-thinking Ukrainian planners had ensured their defenses were sufficient to face a massive armored attack, and with the aid of Western anti-tank weapons, they inflicted a catastrophic toll on Russian vehicles. 13. Civilians began to evacuate from northern and eastern Ukraine, fleeing the advancing Russian armies. This complicated logistics for the Ukrainian military, which had to navigate roads choked with fleeing civilians. 15. Russian forces engaged Ukrainian defenders inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone. 16. Russian troops at the Hostomel airport had been under sporadic attacks by Ukrainian military forces and armed civilians. The 3rd Special Purpose Regiment was rushed to northern Kyiv as preparations were underway for a counterattack. They were joined by the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, who launched an assault to dislodge the Russians before the cargo aircraft could land. With hours to go before a significant Russian force could land, General Valery Zelenskyy ordered the bombardment of the airfields by Ukrainian artillery. The bombardment offered Russian paratroopers a brief reprieve from the punishing artillery fire, but now threatened to derail the entire operation, as Ukrainian artillery cratered the runways Russian aircraft would need to land on. Russian ground attack aircraft, intended to provide suppressive fire and eliminate Ukrainian artillery, were largely absent. Ukrainian fighter aircraft, having survived the initial surprise attack, successfully harassed or intercepted Russian air support. Two things were becoming increasingly clear. The Russian air bridge was increasingly impossible due to the worsening state of the runways, and not enough support aircraft had been dedicated to the task of providing air support for the paratroopers on the ground. Both were valid conclusions, but at the heart of the problem was a fundamental lack of capabilities within the Russian aerospace forces. As the war would later prove, Russian aircraft were ill-suited for ground attack missions, with only a few properly equipped for the task. Furthermore, Russian pilots were undertrained, and the Russian military in general was incapable of effective combined arms operations in the face of determined resistance. 1730. Russian forces captured the Chernobyl exclusion zone. They were ordered to dig themselves into the highly radioactive ground, with many later being evacuated to Belarus for radiation illness. Due to Russian secrecy, the exact number of personnel exposed to dangerous levels of radiation remains unknown, but most of the positions would later be abandoned. 1730. Russia imposed an embargo on naval traffic along Ukrainian shores. 18. The Russian convoy moving south from Belarus towards Kyiv was facing sporadic but effective resistance. Ukrainian troops utilized the terrain to launch ambushes on Russian vehicles, creating crippling traffic snarls that severely impeded the convoy's movement. Russian casualties began to mount as more pressure was put on the convoy to push on to Kyiv, despite the difficulties. A small detachment of armored vehicles managed to break away and rush to reinforce Russian paratroopers at Hostomel airport, but they would not arrive for several hours yet. 19. Under assault by Ukrainian forces, the Russian paratroopers had suffered heavy casualties. The Russians were facing two significant problems. First, expected air support failed to arrive in sufficient numbers to prevent the Ukrainian counterattack. This was due to an intelligence failure by the Russians prior to the war, who had failed to comprehensively map the true strength of Ukrainian defenses around the Kyiv region. They had thus estimated that resistance would be light, and failed to assign enough personnel and air support for the task. The second problem the Russians faced was that a large amount of support equipment had been left behind in the open due to the unexpectedly stiff resistance. Ammo, food, heavy weapons, and more were being systematically destroyed by Ukrainian artillery, which should have been neutralized by air attacks. 20 Ukrainian counterattacks successfully expelled the Russian paratroopers from Hostomel airport. The European Union and United States announced their first round of sanctions against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. The sanctions proved unexpectedly severe. Russia had been counting on a repeat of Western complacency, similar to that shown during the 2014 invasion of Crimea. To make matters worse, Russian President Vladimir Putin had been counting on a swift victory to avert a severe sanctions regime. With the setback at Hostomel airport, this outcome now seemed increasingly unlikely. Russia imposed a freeze on all commercial shipping in the Sea of Azov. With no Ukrainian naval resistance, Russia stood as the sole branch of the Russian military to have met its pre-war objectives. At the end of the first day, Russia had opened a war on every front. Missile bombardments, electronic jamming, naval pressure, ground assaults, even sabotage, but they had failed to hit a key day one goal of securing a usable Kyiv area airbase, nor had they taken out the Ukrainian government or caused an internal collapse. Going into the next day, Russia knew that they needed to lock down an airfield long enough to fly in heavy reinforcements and advance the Kyiv columns before logistical breakdowns and ambushes immobilized them. Meanwhile, Ukraine needed to keep those airfields defunct, keep the roads lethal with ambushes and blown bridges, and preserve command and control long enough for mobilization and external support to begin accumulating. Day 2 conflict theater delves deep into the realities of battlefields from Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. If you're finding this video insightful, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments about which battlefields you'd like us to explore next. The convoys from Belarus continued their approach to Kyiv overnight, but were moving significantly slower than expected. Logistical problems rapidly manifested. A significant amount of gasoline reserved for the Kyiv offensive had been siphoned off and sold by Russian troops to Belarusian civilians in exchange for alcohol, cigarettes, and food in the days leading up to the invasion. A pervasive readiness problem was also apparent. Russian unit commanders were tactically unprepared for combat operations, not having received warning or preparation for the attack until it was already underway. A critical lack of non-commissioned officers in the Russian military only made command and control problems worse. Without professional NCOs, A wide gulf existed between Russian officers and junior enlisted personnel, who were often left to fend for themselves or to execute orders they didn't fully comprehend. The end result was an assault towards Kyiv that had slowed to a snail's pace as the Russian military struggled under the weight of faltering logistics and poor discipline, planning, and training. Ukrainian special forces launched punishing raids against Russian convoys, sowing fear and confusion among the advancing forces. Far from being greeted as liberators, the Russians instead faced a growing number of partisans joining the harassing attacks. Prior to the invasion, the Ukrainian government had distributed vast quantities of firearms to local populations across the country. In the east, Russian artillery engaged in heavy shelling of Kharkiv, indiscriminately targeting military and civilian infrastructure in a brutal attempt to break the defenders. Russian armored assaults were launched once more against the fortress city, early morning to afternoon. In Hostomel, Russian paratroopers had linked up with elements of the ground attack force advancing from Belarus and launched an assault on the airport. Russian armored vehicles, however, came under attack by Ukrainian forces, resulting in the destruction of several columns of armored and infantry fighting vehicles. Those that weathered the ambushes, however, joined a second air assault force and successfully pushed into the Hostomel airport, forcing Ukrainian forces to retreat once more. The Russians dedicated as many as 200 helicopters to the new assault, but once more faced limited effectiveness due to flawed intelligence, dense urban terrain, and resilient Ukrainian air defenses. Russian fighters launched an attack on Kyiv, primarily striking civilians' infrastructure and inflicting minimal damage on its defenses. A Ukrainian Su-27 was shot down in the attempt to repel the attackers. Ukrainian fighters were largely equipped with radars and missiles, a full generation behind their Russian counterparts, placing them at a significant disadvantage in air-to-air combat. On the ground, Russian infiltrators dressed in Ukrainian uniforms entered Obolon, northern Kyiv. Their objective: to seize the building housing Ukraine's parliament. However, they were swiftly discovered and neutralized by Ukrainian troops. Ukrainian militias were organized across the Kyiv region and took active part in defending from Russian attacks. Civilian volunteers fashioned thousands of Molotov cocktails in anticipation of a Russian penetration of the city's defenses. Per Ukrainian intelligence, sympathizers within the Russian FSB who opposed the invasion leaked intelligence on a special unit of Kadyrovites moving into the outskirts of Hostomel, purporting to be elite troops of the Chechen strongman Ramzan Kadyrov. The convoy comprised an estimated 500 fighters and heavy equipment. Their task: the assassination of Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. In Kharkiv, Russian light infantry and some support vehicles successfully infiltrated the city's outskirts. The soldiers were met with confused anger by crowds of civilians. They had been told they would be greeted with flowers as liberators. Civilian protests significantly impeded Russian convoys, allowing Ukrainian defenders time to reconstitute. Launching counterattacks across the city's outskirts, they managed to stop the incursion into Kharkiv. Evening. Russian forces had recaptured Hostomel airport and now manned security checkpoints throughout northern Hostomel. However, the runways were deemed too severely damaged by Ukrainian artillery and sappers to safely accept cargo aircraft. The Russian air assault had ultimately failed in its objectives. Along the Donbas axis, Russian troops made incremental gains across the Avdiivka, Horlivka, and Popasna axis. Resistance was stiffer than expected and better organized than had been planned for. Russian military planners had expected to be over 100 kilometers deep into Ukraine by this point, and were ill-prepared for a protracted, grinding campaign. Despite these setbacks, Russian forces in the south began to link up with forces in the southeast. A major offensive against the strategically crucial city of Mariupol began to take shape. The Ukrainian government publicly acknowledged the risk of Mariupol being cut off by the advancing Russian attack. As night fell, it became increasingly clear that Ukrainian collaborators in the east were actively aiding the Russian offensive. Relaying intelligence on Ukrainian troop movements and fortification strengths, these collaborators were motivated either ideologically or financially. Civilian partisan groups initiated systematic hunts for these collaborators and Russian infiltrators as vigilantism surged across the country. At the end of the second day, Russia was still advancing in places, but the war had not unfolded as planned. The push toward Kyiv was slowing into crippling traffic jams and severe supply problems. And even when Russia regained ground around Kyiv area airfields, it could not reliably transform it into a usable air bridge to rapidly deploy heavy troops and equipment, so the quick win window was closing. Going into the next day, Russia knew that it had to either solve the Kyiv problem, either by making an airfield usable or forcing a clean ground breakthrough around the capital, and at the same time stabilize its logistics to prevent columns from stalling and being picked apart. Meanwhile, Ukraine needed to keep the airbridge defunct, continue striking fuel, trucks, and stalled convoys, and hold the key cities long enough for reinforcements and international support to accumulate and solidify the defense. Day 3. Russian forces moving south from Belarus were devolving into a quagmire. Roads were choked with traffic due to inadequate traffic control by Russian troops and shortages of gasoline and food, stemming from troops selling supplies in Belarus, began to take a significant operational toll. Ukraine increasingly used large, armed drones to harass and destroy Russian vehicles, while Russian air defenses remained stowed in transport configuration. The drone attacks were increasingly unexpected, a novel development in warfare that the Russian military had failed to anticipate on such a scale. To counter the large-body drone threat, Russia expected to rely on the same tools it used to prevent large-scale Ukrainian air attacks: fighter cover and ground-based air defenses. Yet the drones flew low and slow, making them difficult for airborne radars to detect, and Russian fighters found Ukrainian airspace increasingly hostile due to unmolested air defenses. Russia lacked a dedicated suppression destruction of enemy air defenses, or SEAD-DED, capability akin to that of the United States. It relied instead on missile attacks and special forces to neutralize Ukraine's massive inventory of Cold War-era air defenses, while the U.S. employs a rapid hunt-and-kill cycle to physically destroy radars and launchers within minutes. Russia's doctrine was less aggressive, often settling for soft kills that merely suppressed or jammed signals temporarily. However, Ukraine's high mobility, coupled with Russia's poor planning, meant the vast majority survived the initial attack. These defenses were now being reconsolidated, increasingly closing off Ukrainian airspace to Russian aircraft. Among Russia's aerospace forces, a growing reluctance to fly deep inside Ukrainian territory became apparent. To make matters worse for the Kyiv offensive, several key bridges had been destroyed by Ukrainian defenders. These were expected to be rapidly captured and secured by special forces, but Ukraine's own special forces had rendered this difficult, if not impossible, in most cases. Ukraine's special forces launched constant raids against Russian convoys, utilizing Western anti-tank missiles with devastating effect before melting back into the countryside. Sometime in the morning of Day 3, Russia attempted to reopen an air bridge into Kyiv by assaulting the town of Vasilkiv and its nearby military airfield. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, Russian paratroopers managed to land in significant numbers outside Vasilkiv and began marching on the airfield. The Russians were joined by sleeper agents planted in the town in the months before the war. However, they ran straight into the waiting 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade and were forced into a retreat. The second attempt to establish an air bridge into Kyiv failed, and Russia was at last forced to abandon the plan in its entirety. It was clear now that the three-day plan to overthrow the Kyiv regime had failed, much to the global embarrassment of Russia, which, in its attack, had implicitly drawn parallels between its own capabilities and those of the United States of America. Russian forces successfully assaulted the Kyiv hydroelectric power plant, though they incurred significant losses in the process. They would hold the plant for merely 24 hours before being repelled the following day. Ukrainian special forces located and targeted the Kadyrovite detachment tasked with the assassination of President Zelenskyy. One group was intercepted and destroyed on the outskirts of Kyiv, while UAVs spotted 2 additional concentrations of Chechen troops. Ukrainian National Guard and Alpha Group special forces assaulted both Chechen formations, inflicting significant losses and forcing them to retreat. In the east, Russian forces conceded that a blitzkrieg into Kharkiv was impossible. The Russians shifted tactics, no longer committing light infantry and reconnaissance forces to suicidal charges in attempts to create pathways into the city. Instead, Russia began to deploy its forces to surround and isolate the city, while relying on its historical tactic of bombarding civilians within the city with long-range artillery. Despite this, Ukraine remained in firm control of the strategically vital city. In the Donbas region, Russian advances continued, but the expected collapse of the Ukrainian military failed to materialize. Outside Mariupol, Russia's offensive picked up steam. It had now become clear that taking Kyiv was increasingly unlikely, and focus shifted to the seizure of Mariupol. As a major industrial hub, Mariupol held significant strategic and political importance. But of even greater import to the Russian war effort was the ability to save face by seizing it. In 72 hours of fighting, the globally touted three-day victory showed clear signs of not materializing. If Russia could seize Mariupol, it would help the nation save political face. By the end of the day, the northeastern Russian offensive was 36 kilometers from the center of Kyiv, but was in an increasingly dire logistical state and with degraded combat capability due to poor planning and incessant Ukrainian attacks. Russian planners were forced to accept that Kyiv was unlikely to fall anytime soon and began preparations for a more traditional ground campaign against the city. They had the hardware in place, but it was hopelessly submerged in a growing traffic jam that would soon become legendary in the annals of modern warfare. And that's the real end of Day 3 picture. Russia had reached striking distance of Kyiv, but not control of Kyiv. The blitzkrieg calculus was gone. Too much road, too little fuel, too many ambushes, and no clean air bridge to reset the tempo, so the war pivoted from a sprint to a brutal grind. From here on, every kilometer towards the capital would have to be paid for the old-fashioned way, with slow advances, heavy artillery, and siege logic, while Ukraine's entire strategy became keeping those columns stuck, bleeding, and disorganized long enough for the defenders, and the outside support behind them, to turn time into a formidable weapon. Where does it all end? As of the time of this video, nearly 2 years after it began on February 24, 2022, the answer is still unknown. Conflict theater delves deep into the realities of battlefields, from Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. If you found this video insightful, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments about which conflict, battle, or campaign you'd like us to cover next. See you on the field of battle.